.hack GU Last ReCode is a 2017 remaster of the .hack follow-up series .hack GU from the PS2 era. And just like its predecessor, this series is couched within the .hack universe with its own companion anime .hack Roots that serves as a prologue to the events of GU. As discussed with .hack IMOQ, the context provided by Roots is not requisite, but it, along with other .hack content, certainly allows for greater immersion. Before we dive in, I just want to get this bit out of the way. I don't like GU. I will say some good things and some not so good things about it, but I think it's important to say up front that overall I find GU to be a very disappointing follow-up to IMOQ. As I will be saying many good things in praise of this series, I did just want to make that clear from the very beginning. Now, usually I start with the story and a little bit of an introduction to the overall plot, but I actually want to break with tradition and start with gameplay, and yes, my OCD brain is shaking at the thought of this break from routine. All in all, the gameplay is a massive improvement over its predecessor. That was probably my chief complaint about .hack IMOQ. The world building and storytelling is probably my favorite in all of the wild world of gaming. But the gameplay is lackluster and monotonous, relying too much on menu interaction. Not so in GU. The gameplay is much more active and demands that we pay attention and respond accordingly. We start with the same mechanic of the X button serving as our attack button. However, GU adds some nice nuance to the mix, which is a theme we will see throughout pretty much the entirety of the gameplay experience. While the X button is your primary attack button, we now are able to use it in various ways, influenced first and foremost by what weapon we have equipped. You see, in Volume 1, Haseo can equip dual swords and later broadswords as well, which naturally changes up the basic attack performed by pressing X. Not only does this make sense, it's a nice touch. In addition to this, we can hit X quickly to do combo attacks, or we can hold X down to do one powerful attack that will break through an enemy's guard and send it flying. Additionally, the various weapons we can equip now have a bearing on what kind of attacks are at our disposal. At the end of every combo attack with dual swords, our specific weapon has a finishing flourish, which just requires us to continually tap X or hold X depending on the weapon for extra hits and damage. And this is just the nuance added to the X button. We haven't even really gotten into the flow of combat yet, but before we do, let's talk about another simple yet necessary addition. We can now guard by pressing the circle button. We needed this so much. While there was strategy in IMOQ, a lot of it involved responding to enemy attacks that had already landed, attempting to mitigate the potential status ailment consequences of those attacks. That's all well and good, but guard gives us the option to preempt attacks. In fairness, we could use items and spells in IMOQ to prevent spellcasting and or skill usage, but that required foreknowledge of what a particular enemy was capable of. With guard, even if we aren't familiar with a particular enemy, we can at least mitigate the potentially disastrous effects of its attack by guarding, which again, speaks to GU's gameplay experience, requiring much more involvement from the player and moving strategy away from excessive and tedious menu interaction. The next button we'll talk about is the R1 button, which activates our skill trigger. Again, this is a nice simple update that moves us away from menu interaction. By pressing this button, we can use skills that are more powerful attacks that can't really be blocked. But wait, there's more! Here's the portion where we move away from button inputs because, believe it or not, these are only the tip of the iceberg. The skill trigger has another important use that can easily turn the tides in our favor in even the most challenging of battles this game throws at us. As we're whacking away at an enemy, slowly chipping away at its health, we can start to notice glowing rings surrounding its body, which is our signal that we can use a ReCode. This is a special instance of the skill trigger that provides several bonuses upon use. It's an even more powerful version of our selected skill that provides more weapon experience, which is instrumental in raising our weapon level and gaining access to more skills, and it raises our team's morale gauge. We'll get to that in a second. Again, the skill trigger and ReCode are great ways to encourage active participation in combat, and I'm here for them. The final update to the flow of combat I want to discuss is the morale gauge. When you enter an area, this starts at 0, but as you and your party members make your way through various battles, it will start to fill up depending on ReCodes used and other actions you take that your party members like. When the gauge is full, you can press the square button, which will activate your awakening. When this happens, the enemies are frozen in place and you can just whack away at them, dealing extra damage. Again, this is another great addition that can easily tip the scales in your favor. The only thing I don't like about combat is spellcasting. For one, it's unnecessary for Haseo. Despite that, Haseo has access to any spell for which you can acquire a scroll. You can teach him a variety of attacking and healing spells, but again, why would you? It's awkward to navigate the interface to actually cast those spells, and your other party members are much more effective in that role while you do the primary damage dealing. The fact that it exists at all is unfortunate, because it means that you could make Haseo more of a spellcaster if you really wanted to, but it wouldn't look or feel pretty, and that's completely on the devs. I'm gonna stick avatar battles here as well because I guess it's technically combat related, though it feels more like a mini game than anything else. In IMOQ, Kite's trump card was his data drain, which was just a skill that he used on various enemies whose data had been corrupted. The boss battles still require normal combat, but then you'd have to data drain at a crucial moment in order to reach the conclusion of the boss battle and advance. This worked and didn't need to be changed, or if it did, avatar battles in GU was not the answer. These battles are tedious and clunky. You have 3 actions you can perform in this ugly, void-like hellscape, whereas regular combat is delightfully nuanced and immersive. The comparative dearth of actions at our disposal in avatar battles makes for a tedious and unnecessary experience. With all that, we've covered the basics of updates to the gameplay mechanics of combat from IMOQ to GU. There were some crucial, smart updates to the combat experience that make GU so much more enjoyable than its predecessor, but we'll see shortly that a mostly solid gameplay experience is never enough for a successful RPG. And now I think it's time we get to the story. GU follows Haseo, a former player killer. Let's pause for a second and talk about what and why that is. You see, in this updated version of the world, player killing becomes much more prevalent as established in Roots. Actually, Haseo is player killed within minutes of his first ever login to the world. He thinks about giving up, but then he meets Shino. Haseo starts to open up and have fun with Shino and Ovan throughout the anime, but he also harbors a deep-seated hatred for player killers, which eventually leads him down the path of player killer. The last straw is when Shino gets data drained by Azure Kite, the supposed villain of our story. Unfamiliar with the mysteries lurking in the darkest corners of the world, Haseo assumes that Azure Kite is just another malicious player killer, so he makes it his personal vendetta to take him down, as well as any other player killer out there. Here's where GU picks up. We see Haseo in all his edgelord glory, ruthlessly cutting down any player killer, including the notorious Bordeaux. Then Ovan informs Haseo of Azure Kite's possible location, and he hurries there for a showdown. Azure Kite data drains Haseo back down to a level 1 weenie, and that's where our journey starts. In an Odyssean arc, Haseo must spend the 3 volumes of GU reclaiming his former glory and seeking vengeance. Of course, he'll learn and grow along the way, but not really enough to make his character sympathetic in my opinion. Yes, here's where we complain about Haseo's character. I hate him as the protagonist. We have several characters from which to choose as our protagonists, like Haseo, who were also characters in the first iteration of the world and even made appearances in IMOQ. And we landed on Haseo. I admit I may have just outgrown this character type, but he is an insufferable edgelord who is just obsessed with his own power and will stop at nothing to achieve his own goals with absolutely no regard for the well-being of the people around him who, I might add, provide much-needed assistance. But does he care who gets hurt along the way? No, not as long as people recognize his power. God, just shut up already. And if this doesn't sound at all familiar to you, you obviously never watched Naruto. Haseo is just basically Sasuke. It doesn't help that the English voice actor happens to be Sasuke's voice actor as well, but these 2 spiky-headed crybabies could get isekai'd into each other's worlds, and no one would be the wiser. To be fair, Haseo does exhibit some character growth throughout Volume 1, but then he turns around and acts in ways that aren't consistent with that growth. I had many moments where I had to admit, filled with chagrin, that I was actually starting to like this asshole, only to have to recant mere minutes later. I am dreading the fact that I have to sit through 2 more volumes of Haseo as the protagonist. Again, maybe it's my age showing, but there's a reason Sasuke wasn't the protagonist. His is a compelling character, I argue, precisely because he isn't the protagonist of the series. This type of character just doesn't work in the pilot seat of the story. It's a strong character to be sure, but we need someone more sympathetic at the helm. Having to stew in Salky Magoo's self-made miasma of misery for 10+ hours gets old real fast. Though perhaps a bit reductive, my comparison of Haseo and Sasuke is actually symptomatic of the main issue with GU's writing. It is overly derivative, to the point of being almost completely unoriginal, which is such a crying shame because there is so much originality and amazing writing in the vast majority of the .hack universe. To offer an overly simplistic and cute explanation, it's like the writers sat around a table and thought, man, this writing business is pretty tough, isn't it? All those characters to develop in believable, consistent ways, all that world building, that's too much to ask of us. Why don't we just make this anime? And make GU anime they did. Instead of actual characterization and development, .hack GU is just anime tropes and cliches out the wazoo. We see hardly any of the depth we saw in IMOQ, and to make matters worse, GU does hardly any world building. and any efforts are hamstrung by an over-reliance on the lore of the world R1 and not enough attention to our world as such. That's right, the writers wrote themselves into a corner by focusing too much on the lurking shadow of the world R1 and not encouraging enough immersion in the version of the world that our GU characters actually inhabit. One of the best parts of IMOQ was the feeling of wonder for the world that the writing instilled in us, through thread posts, epitaph fragments, etc. Any mystery or intrigue we encounter on discussion boards or posts on forums all pretty much couch themselves in the previous version of the world. And that's important because it is all connected. But it falls flat because there's hardly any significant world building done for the current version of the world. Sure, we have a couple mysteries in the forms of Ida and Azure Kite, but we don't get enough development of these in Volume 1 to move from initial cluelessness to fervent intrigue. We can't even begin to form our own opinions of what these might be or signify because we have no details with which to work. On top of that, there aren't really any missions or objectives that encourage us to interact with the mysteries of the world R2. We have like 2 goofy Pyros missions where we sort of get at this, and 1 accidental encounter with the irregularities when we're out exploring with Atali, but other than that, most of the side quests and objectives are mere fetch quests or experience farming that don't really matter in the grand scheme of things. All in all, the writing is such a letdown. It's lazy, it's over-reliant on not just tropes and cliches, but on facts established by other content in the wider .hack context. I love how connected everything is in .hack, but the writers still needed to forge a way ahead and with equally stellar character work and world building, and instead they chose laziness. What a disappointment. And speaking of disappointments, while the series gets a much needed facelift and the overall visual presentation, I found the cutscenes to be particularly jarring. Cutscenes varied in terms of quality, which isn't necessarily a bad thing. Not all cutscenes are equal. Some are inevitably more significant than others and should use more resources. My chief complaint is that one cutscene could vary in quality and that just didn't work. You see, for the most part, characters' faces are static during cutscenes, but if the devs thought a character would be delivering an impactful line, they would then choose to fully animate the character during that line's delivery, and then it would go back to low budget again mid-cutscene. I get why the team thought this would be a good idea, but the contrast in quality made the whole thing look bad and it proved to be distracting. It would have worked better to either expend the extra effort throughout the entire cutscene or not. This halfway crap just didn't work. I guess there are more things to cover in this game, but I really don't see the point. What I've touched on are the main components of the game and should be enough to help you decide whether or not the 2017 remaster is worth your consideration. As I said at the beginning, I don't like GU. But that's because storytelling is really important to me. If you're looking for a fun gameplay experience and don't really mind lazy writing, you might yet eke out some enjoyment from this game.